Welcome to our fantastic panel for this afternoon, 1 p.m. here in Cork, Ireland. I'm as chair of the IFIP 8.3 Decision Support Group. I'm joined by my IFIP 8.3 officers from a variety of locations around the world, and we're delighted to welcome you to this particular panel where we're engaging with a group of international experts, and we thank them for their time and their expertise to talk about this really exciting, interesting and provocative topic of ChatGPT and generative AI, particularly with the IFIP 8.3 focus on the impact, the opportunities, the challenges for human decision making. It's with great pleasure I hand you over to today's moderator, Professor Gloria Phillips-Wren, Officer of IFIP 8.3, joining us from Selinger Business School, Loyola, Maryland. So thank you, Gloria.
Thanks very much, Kira. It's a delight to kind of re-meet so many of you. I've had so many nice notes from people across the world. So thank you for joining us. And I particularly would like to thank really a wonderful panel that we have. So the group that we have online are going to share their perspectives from a variety of backgrounds about a technology that's really almost burst onto the public imagination. And so what we really want to look a little bit at the limitations of that technology, some of the ethical, legal implications, together with really just how does it work and what does it really have to say, or how does it help us or maybe hinder us when it comes to decision making, which really is the focus of our group. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to very briefly introduce themselves, and then we have a series of questions. We do welcome questions from those of you who are participating remotely and watching. There is a Q&A that's open, and we'll be monitoring that. So we don't promise we'll get to every single question, but we certainly will attempt to answer as many of those questions as we can. So I'm just going to start in no particular order, almost the way they are on the screen, to ask folks to talk just a little bit about yourself very briefly, and also maybe your interest or your involvement really in this really new and emerging area. So Elizabeth, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Sure. Thank you, Gloria, and thank you, Kira, and all who are here this morning. Morning for me, afternoon for you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Elizabeth Kennedy. I'm a professor of law and social responsibility at the Selinger School of Business at Loyola University, Maryland, along with Gloria. My interest in this topic is I look at issues of ethics and law, and really the intersections of racial equity, labor power, and justice, and technology, emerging technologies like ChatGPT. So I'm really excited to be here learning more from the technical side, but with this focus on human decision making, which I think is so critical to keep centered as we have these conversations. So thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Mark.
Wonderful. Thank you. Mark Parity, Vice President, Data Strategy for Northwell Health. Northwell Health is the largest health system in New York State, largest employer in New York State, 20 some odd hospitals, 900 some odd outpatient clinics of one form or another. I've been doing data science, machine learning, and AI for about 20 years. Have been interested in artificial intelligence going back to iRobot and Isaac Asimov. So this has been a passion and a field of interest of mine for a long time, and it's been very exciting to see it actually, what was science fiction, become science reality.
Thank you. That's a good byline, I think. Science fiction becomes reality. Very cool. Peter.
Hi, thank you, Gloria, and everyone for having me on. My name is Peter Guerra. I've been doing data and AI consulting for about 20 years now. I'm currently at Microsoft, where I work with customers on large AI applications and deployments and solutions. So front and center of all the GPT explosion that's been happening, and really, really great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. We're looking forward to it too. Kieran.
Hi all. I'll start by maybe giving a bit of my academic background and build up for there. So I started doing maths and statistics as an undergraduate, and then figured, well, statistics was the practical application of maths using data, so maybe I should go that direction. And just at the time when the whole analytics, now called data science, whatever we want to call it, right, was exploding. So I've been involved in consulting using data, as the way I always put it, and tools then like statistics, AI, analytics, basically to solve business problems. My last job was as global advanced analytics lead in Accenture. Current is in KPMG, again sort of working with clients globally to basically try and address their business problems through the use of data and these kind of technology. So self-taught in the computer science space. Started off in text mining and neural networks for classification problems, all of that. So it's I'm the one with the hands in the weeds, let's say, the fingers in the weeds.
One of the things I really like about what you said, and it is really for our audience, is that this is a very accessible area. So those of you who maybe don't feel like you come from computer science or come from some background, one of the things that I guess that we hope to encourage is research in this area. So it is an area that's accessible, and you can self-teach all the way to having, very deep degrees in this field. So we do encourage that. Okay, I have a series of questions, and I'm going to just start with my very first question, which I really was one of my questions, so hopefully you'll find it interesting. And that is really, what is generative AI and how is it different, if you will, from traditional AI? So, and I've asked Peter to lead off on this question and talk a little bit about the underlying technology, because usually when we think about AI systems, you're really thinking about a neural network, right? But something different seems to be happening here. And so Peter's going to try to explain it so we all understand it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'll do my best, but of course, ask fellow panelists to chime in. I think we're all very familiar with, statistics, the basic underpinning of a lot of machine learning and the statistics and mathematical models that drive that. And in traditional machine learning applications, you typically would use a lot of data and an algorithm to train on, and then it would give you some sort of specific output that you're looking for. What's different about this part of AI and generative AI is it's actually generating something in a much more creative way, seemingly, I'll say pseudo creative way, seemingly creative way. And I think that's really what has kind of sparked the imagination of so many around this particular type of technology. So generative AI is a very specific to it being able to create through mathematical algorithms a variety of different associations, as well as images and things like that. And we'll see examples of that like ChatGPT, which is what we're talking about, where you can ask a question and it will respond back in a very human way. And the way that it creates that very human-ish response is as a result of a number of different breakthroughs. There's transformers, self-attention, and so forth. There's a great paper called "Attention is All You Need" that came out in 2017. A bunch of researchers that were thinking through how do you make associations within large volumes of text in a much more accurate way than we've been able to do before. And the result of that is what we have now, these large machine like language models that it takes huge amounts of text, billions or trillions of different parameters, and then calculates those associations in order for you then to be able to ask it a question, and it has that already in it. And then what it does is then it uses that to create a very creative and natural response. And it's a very different way of interacting with models than we've seen before, because the barrier to entry is much lower. You don't have to have advanced statistics knowledge. You don't have to create an algorithm. It's already pre-trained for you, and so you can just interact with it and see its output. So it is a little bit different way that we've seen us having to produce models and so forth before.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add anything to that?
I think it's because it's this new capability, and maybe this is the purpose of this conversation. It's still not clear where it's going to be used, right? Most people that have interacted with it have interacted with it, treating it like as a toy or for fun. I was able to write a poem on, in the style of William Burns or something, or write a song like Puff Daddy. Right? We've seen all of those all over the internet. I think that's one of the key differences that I see, because when I said I was started early on with neural networks, that was relatively simple problems, classification problems, prediction problems, you know, that kind of thing. So it was well understood that, okay, you're using better tools, better data to give me better results. I think one of the key differences here is a general lack of understanding, and not just on the business side, but also on within AI practitioners themselves, unless they've specialized in this area. I think that's a gap, a big gap.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move to question 2. Again, feel free to jump in, and panelists, if you have something you think of later, this is really a conversation, so please feel free to join in anytime along the way. Okay, so my second question, we are throwing to Peter, and he gets a really, I'm sorry, we're going to throw to Kieran. We throw to Kieran, and it's going to be a really kind of a tough question, and that is, can generative AI think like a human? And I'm kind of thinking here, as we were thinking about this question, along the idea of decision-making and rationality, if you will, in terms of that. I don't think anyone probably on this panel wants to argue that it's sentient, although you're welcome to, if you'd like. But Kieran, what do you think about that? Can generative AI think like a human?
I asked you, Gloria, was just the philosophical question around AI. I think it's still, there's still an element there, right? Because if I look at what ChatGPT does in particular, it's essentially makes best guess at the sequence of words that comes together to make a sentences. Right? If I was to try and summarize it in one word, but that lacks any, you know, it's pattern recognition, right? So it can actually very realistically, very intelligently give you back some concise information. If you're looking for text summarization, that, you know, that's excellent. But it doesn't think in any real sense. It has no has no parameters or controls, you know, to keep it in the area of rationality, right? I've looked at some papers, it's kind of interesting, on where German researchers were testing it on the trolley problem and the switch problem. And of course, it'll argue convincingly for whatever ethical standpoint you want to argue from. So, you know, there's a couple of fundamentals that we need to build trust, right? And we're not, you know, KPMG, where I work now, right, but there are loads of these, did a global survey on trust in AI. And typically it's 40% or less that actually trust in AI. You know, there's a real either ambivalence or unwillingness to trust. And you know, that's always going to be a barrier. That's always going to be a barrier to adoption for business decisions. And the other thing is, you know, in the EU, we're slightly different than the rest of the world. We're looking to regulate AI, and there's EU regulations. And when ChatGPT initially came out, the lawmaker advisors to the EU suggested it goes into the high-risk category, right? And the high-risk category is where it needs significant governance, human intervention, etc. It's since been pushed down a little bit into a more, you know, general tool, and it's the applications that you need to build on it. But where are we going to see it in the short term, you know, making decisions? I think in all the regulated spaces, we're not going to see it. I think we will. It'll probably leap out from where it's already doing well, from where, say, chatbots and sort of digital assistants are. That will be the easiest way to expand. But there are some interesting applications, right? The judge in Cartagena used AI to summarize part of his judgment, and but he did it clearly saying it saved me time in having to write it all out, basically, and could summarize it, and he was the human in the loop. So, you know, applications where it doesn't really impact human safety, human livelihoods, I think we'll probably have quick adoption as an assistant, where it's making decisions without a sort of ethical framework or rationale framework, and with a lack of trust. I just don't see that happening in the short term.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I'll be a little bit of the contrarian in this, because I know the received wisdom is that it's ChatGPT and these other technologies are simply statistical models, right, that are parroting back on what they've learned, and they've got all of these very well-defined holes and places where they fail when compared against human intelligence or human capability. And I certainly acknowledge all of those, right? That's all obviously very real. But I would argue probably the vast majority of human language and cognition and interaction is very close to just predicting the next best word, right? We tend to say the same things over and over again. We tend to have similar thoughts. There are patterns in the ways that we speak and that we interact with each other. So by no means would I say that any of these technologies are sentient yet, or that we've achieved artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence. I think we're actually probably much farther along than we think we are, right? And if you take a look at ChatGPT 3 versus ChatGPT 4, where several of the papers that were poking holes in the ChatGPT technology were written against ChatGPT 3, and many of those are resolved in ChatGPT 4. Very true. There's still fundamental issues around planning, right? There's some fundamental issues around reasoning. There are a lot of aspects about what makes a human in terms of we're all kind of born with or inborn with an ethical framework. Now, there's obviously a lot of variability in that ethical framework. People come up with very different sets of ethics, but it's all kind of there. We're all kind of born in with a theory of mind, right? For the most part, we all acknowledge or believe that just like we have a mind inside our own head, there are minds inside the heads of everyone that we're interacting with. We've got a bunch of most of us have a series of social constraints, right? We don't want to embarrass ourselves, right? And all these things put guardrails, right, around how we think and the actions that we take and the sorts of work that we do. But the way that I see that is that this technology is moving so fast that every time we identify one of these areas, that basically becomes someone's PhD thesis, right? And within 6 to 12 months, it's usually addressed in one form or another. So to my mind, I'm much less concerned about trying to poke holes in the technology today, and much more interested in thinking about, well, what is this going to be like in 3 to 5 years, right? When it is planning, right? When it does have ethics or some type of a moral framework, when it does have a theory of mind, right? When we have begin to embody these in the sense that we've connected them. It's not just a language model, but we've connected it to a robot, right? And it's able to sort of move and interact in the world, and it's interacting with people and learning in real time. And that's sort of another thing. ChatGPT at the moment doesn't really learn in real time. It learns within a session and has memory within a session, but it doesn't sort of take that from one place to the next. But again, that's an engineering challenge, right? There's no physical barrier, right, that prevents us from building that. It's just a matter of time.
Interesting. Thank you. That's a really interesting perspective. Elizabeth, I think you had something you could jump in on.
Yeah, I think, and I hear all that. I think the one thing I would push us to recognize is how often we talk about, as Mark just did, sort of the we, and who the we is, and who, even when we say, does ChatGPT think like a human? Well, which humans, right? The humans who have access to this technology, the humans who are training it, the humans who, like all of us in these little boxes, we, I think, could trace a lot of commonalities just looking at us and our education and the degree of power we have in coming up with what we think are acceptable uses of this technology, what we think those guardrails should look like, what interests we need to protect. And I would say, and this really is at the heart of all of the ethical issues that we'll talk about today, but really the voices of those who stand to be most harmed by this technology are the voices that are not in any of these debates, are not at the table creating the guardrails, are not those who are doing the programming. They are very much often a part of the creation of this technology and its application, and global ghost workers. And there's so many people who are a part of this, but that are not centered in this. So I think just when we think about the we in these conversations, just be mindful of who we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely agree with that. And it's interesting because your models are only as good as the data that it's trained on. And we hear billions of parameters, and it was trained on, all of Wikipedia was one of the things I said. It was like, well, that's not even a valid source. Wikipedia is not even a valid source in at least my kids' high school, much less, in a setting where it may be a critical decision. that needs to be made. And so, it's only as good as the billions, trillions, or whatever of parameters they have. And we see that too with GPT-3 and 3.5, which was only completed in 2021, has recency bias, right? It doesn't even know recent stuff. Now, GPT-4 solved that by going and fetching the most recent information. But it's just, there's always going to be challenges with this, which is why you always need to, we always recommend, Nick, you have to build things around it in order to test it. A couple things I'll just mention real quick. There's a really good paper written about this called Sparks of AGI that's on the archival server. It was written by a bunch of researchers. They talk about theory of mind, which, Mark, you had touched on, which is the idea that, humans, as they grow up, only become aware that other people have a mind and have an opinion until, like, anybody who has a toddler knows that, it doesn't come until a little bit later on, like 4 or 5 or whatever. That's where I think, I have teenagers, so sometimes you wonder, right? And even also driving on the road, like, you see people do things and you're like, that was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like, what is this person thinking? Anyway, so there's like all of these, even just as humans, there's all these kind of questions and so forth. It is very important to understand the technology, all it is doing is making associations that have already been made. So it's just taking what it's been fed and just recognizing those patterns to predict in ways that, humans have already done or lack of done. But that article is really good. That paper is really good because it talks about theory of mind and how it seems to pass a lot of those as a result of those tests, as a result of the connections that have already been made that it then discovers and then puts out as part of that model. So I think, and I would stress that I don't think personally that we'll ever get to something that is an true artificial intelligence that's sentient, because that would mean that it would have will. And I don't think that any of us would argue that math can have its own will. So, I mean, we could go into deep philosophical, arguments here, but at least my personal view is that, this is not something that will ever, it may appear that way, but it won't ever get to that point where it's truly, sentient in that way.
But just
Thank you.
make one more point. I'm with the guys, right? I'm very optimistic. I have been all my working life, right? And as you watch all the capability get created and build up, but I think we're either at or very close to an inflection point where we have to actually change the way we do data engineering and data science. Because if again, let me roll back 20 years. As a statistician, you're always working on small data, and much of the early applications you're working on databases, and regardless, it was very well understood, and you could, in general, understand what the key drivers are. But if we take, and I know it's a later question, if we take that there is some element, or at least fear, of the threat of AI, we don't engineer in the same way that aircraft manufacturers engineer, right? We just build it, right? Can we get to a utility? Can we make it work? It's the old, why do you climb Everest? Because it's there, right? We want to solve the problem. But I think we will need to bring almost aircraft engineering type principles to how you build up your data sets, build up your models, build tolerances in, right? The only thing we ever look at is some level of accuracy, some measure of accuracy, and go, bang, I can hit the target more times than not. I think we'll get to it later, but the way all the work that has been done so far, building on data analytics and AI, I think we're going to need to do it, to make a fundamental change.
Thank you. I want to kind of pick up on those ideas and move to a question that I'm going to ask Mark to lead off. And I'm really kind of interested now in thinking about applications. So I think Kieran described it as a toy. And for many of us that have played with it, probably that's what it's been, like a little bit of a toy to kind of see what it will do and how it'll answer the questions. And so I'm asking him to lead us off in terms of, is the current systems that we have, or maybe the ones that we envision in the near future, able to really emulate at least some complex decision making. And I'm going to point specifically to healthcare. So some of the early applications that you start reading about, at least that I've read about, is some of the major databases out there. I think the one most recently I read about was Epic, and an application of this technology. So there's a point at which, if it's going to be a workhorse or something that we can use, and that those of you that are in the consulting area, your business partners, are going to be asking you, can it do more than just be an assistant, right? And I want to kind of also think about, when you look at that idea, that really in some of the decision-making support systems that we have out there, there is an underlying logic. It's an algorithmic one in many cases, but essentially it provides the guardrails, essentially, in a way, right? I mean, the different variables are there that are brought in, but there is an underlying logic almost in the math itself. And so I want Mark to kind of lead us toward the idea of applications and what maybe, at least in the near term, we can think of as ways to exploit this technology for the good, hopefully. So Mark, take it away.
Yeah, probably equally as challenging a question as the theory of mind question. One of the things one of the fundamental tensions that I think we have in AI, and we've actually had it for a while, is should AI be an assistive technology, or should it be a replacing technology, right? And I think where people are, or let me, to keep the alliteration, should it be an assistive technology or an automating technology, right? And so in an assistive technology, and I've heard many clinicians sort of express it this way, wouldn't it be great to have the smartest resident you've ever worked with, who is the most up to date on all the recent knowledge, sort of looking over your shoulder and gently whispering, hey, did you think about that? Or hey, good point, or maybe look over here, kind of thing, right? To really help them make sure that they don't miss anything, that they're thinking through all the opportunities and all the possibilities, right? And there's a lot of options or opportunities to use these technologies, as there has been for a while, in these sort of assistive roles, right? Where effectively they're just sort of backstopping the human decision making, right? Or adding a little bit of hey, did you think about this? Now, on the one hand, that can be taken to its extreme, which you see in a lot of the electronic medical records, where it's just pop-up after pop-up. Did you think about this weird interaction? Did you think about this strange disease, right? And it becomes almost intrusive, and it slows down the care process. So there has to be a balance there. That approach doesn't particularly worry me, and there's a lot of interesting things you can do there, right? So the announcement with Epic, for instance, part of what they're doing is, you may have heard that clinicians these days are again, as these EHRs are opening up, they're being bombarded with text messages and questions from their panel of patients, and they just don't have enough time in the day to go through and write reasoned answers to all these things. And so they're looking at, can they use ChatGPT to write a draft of the answer that the clinician can then go and read through and say, yes, I agree, or disagree, or change a few points here or there. Again, an assistive technology, but still effectively moving at the speed of a single human, right? A lot of value comes from that. Don't want to take anything away from that, but where the real ethical questions come in, and I think where the real challenge comes in, is, well, what happens when you start automating, right? And so, for instance, there are already algorithms that can look at breast images, right, and be able to determine with a very high degree of accuracy which ones are likely to have breast cancer and which ones aren't. And there is no human who can look at those and determine and see anything in the either of those images to say which one does or doesn't have breast cancer. You can look at electrocardiogram traces, right? And while this doesn't have particular clinical use, it just makes the point. No human can look at an ECG trace and tell whether it was a male or a female, right? That trace came from. There are AI algorithms that can very accurately identify whether the patient was male or female simply on the basis of heart activity, right? So the question now becomes, okay, we would want to, you no longer have a human who can, you're no longer assisting a human in this process. There's no longer a human who can double check or backstop. You're relying on the technology against the data that you've previously collected, right? And hopefully, ideally too, as we're building these things, we're not just building them off of a static data set, but we're taking into account new data because the world changes, right? We all learned that very dramatically with COVID, right? There was a day before COVID and a day after COVID, and the world was sort of totally different between those two. And that was hard for humans to adapt to, even harder for algorithms to adapt to those types of changes. But what do we do when we say, you know, how many lives would have been saved, right, if we trusted the algorithms when no human could say yay or nay, versus how many lives would we have harmed, right? Because the algorithms are going to get wrong sometimes. And one of the things I always try to remind people, humans get it wrong all the time, right? We hold these algorithms to this standard that they must be perfect. They can never make a mistake, right? They must be omniscient in some way, yet no human is omniscient. We talk about how ChatGPT has sort of blind spots or can hallucinate. I know plenty of humans who hallucinate, right, and come up with crazy conspiracy theories and see things that aren't there, right, and report and state things that didn't happen as if they did happen, right? So in many ways, right, I think a lot of these technologies are actually much closer to human than we think, right? We're focusing on all of these mistakes that they make, but I think those are differences in degree rather than differences in kind, right, between humans and those. So that's kind of the broad framework that I would look at or think through that type of a decision, right? Without going down the rabbit hole of let's really define what a complex decision-making process is, and is it really truly just an algorithm with a series of steps, or is there actual creativity in the process, right? To Peter's point.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that we look at, you know, from a responsible AI perspective is, you know, there's a framework of what's the decision that needs to be made and its potential impact to make that delineation as to whether or not, you know, it's right for it to be an assistive technology or more of a decision making. For example, in customer care, they get inundated with calls. To respond back, you usually get, if you send an email or something to your like telecommunications provider, your mobile phone provider, you'll get an email right back saying, hey, thanks, we'll get back to you. Well, that one can be automated to be much more human-like response that makes that connection between customer and, you know, your enterprise better. But I mean, if, you know, it says something it shouldn't say, I mean, it's not like, you know, people aren't going to truly be harmed, right? Like if you're harmed by an automated email from your telco provider, like that's a whole separate issue. But you know, I mean, there's different gradients for having. In health, it's incredibly important to understand the limitations of these technologies. You know, for example, we won't generally recommend or even use the technology for anything that is related to something that could, you know, really harm or have a very difficult patient outcome in any way, automated way, like ever. It's just like a line that should, in my mind, not be crossed, right? And this is my opinion. There are a lot of complex things that happen in the human body that we don't even really fully understand. And, you know, I don't think that, you know, AI should be in a decision making in when it comes to that. But there's hundreds of different other use cases around health where there's right now people who are shuffling data from one place to another. They just have to interrogate data or search for data. They just have to understand and have something kind of summarized for them. And that's where I think these technologies are really, you know, really beneficial in the health environment.
Yeah, I think there are areas that are beyond just the assistive, right? The one, and listen, this is not my area, but it's one of the things that I came across in my research of the Prost GPT-2, right? Which is an application, you know, it's a language model for protein design, right? And why we're designing proteins, right? I remember when I was working with a life sciences organization, just the vast morass of published papers, even using different language for more or less the same thing, is just impossible for humans to wade through, right? So part of their ask is, well, isn't that what your AI stuff is supposed to do? Help us here, right? So there are applications like that. Again, I couldn't say whether it's good or bad, but you know, the initial research seems to be that it finds novelty, it finds things that humans won't find. And again, of course, it's not making a decision, it's finding these patterns that may be beyond the human, which certainly stretches the capability of the human. You know, it doesn't suddenly decide, well, that's the protein and I'm going to put it on the manufacturing line, right? It's part of a process, right? So I think there'll be applications we don't even imagine, right? But based on that large languages and these kind of associations across massive corpuses of data.
And I do still put that example into the category of assistive, right? Because fundamentally it's preparing or chewing through or going through a large amount of data and then presenting some summarization of that, right, to a human, that the human is then making a fundamental, decision off of, right? So it's still, you're still relying on the human for the choice of when and how and where, and the creativity and context and the rest of it, right? And so that's kind of how and why I make that distinction between those two, right? And it does get into sort of finer grained distinctions beneath that, but.
We have a related question from the audience, so I'm going to put this one in, and then I want to turn to the ethical side of this, particularly with Elizabeth. But the question from the audience, which I think is a really interesting question, so thank you for the question. And the idea here is, does AI-generated text restrict humans from thinking outside the box? So essentially, do we just rely on machine output and stop thinking in a way? That's kind of what the question is. Thanks. Interesting question. Thank you. I'll let any of our panelists that want to chime in.
So I'll leap in on this one. How many people can read a map, right? How many people, when you're looking at an atlas, go and know what the little numbers in red are and the little numbers in black are, and which ones are supposed to map to exit numbers and which ones are supposed to map to miles or distance between the various exits, so you can plan out your route? Nobody does that anymore, right? Because we all have these phones in our pocket that do that for us. And so on the one hand, there's definitely a skill that's been lost. And if the global GPS system ever went down, or our phones, or when the cell towers stop working, a lot of us are like, it used to be when you got a new car, the first thing you did was you went and you bought a road atlas, right? For your country, and then for your state, or your sort of locality, and then for your city, right? And that was, you couldn't think about functioning in a car without that, right? And so if we were to lose the technology, right, we would lose that. So there's no doubt that these types of technologies will cause the loss of some sort of skill or some sort of intellectual muscle memory. But in theory, the benefits that we get out of that will far exceed, right, the loss of those, right? Although we do now kind of rely on the fact that, we have to have electricity, we have to have internet connectivity, right? We have to have the cell phone towers up and running. I mean, it's kind of scary sometimes to think that it was only 16 years ago that the iPhone came out, right? And every now and then I think back to what was life like in 2005 or 1995 or 1985. I was just chatting with my wife about Atari, right? How many people remember Atari and Atari video games, right? Like that was just a different, exactly, right? And it just, the whole zeitgeist was different at the time. And I don't know that you could say one was better or worse without picking a specific set of metrics and the value judgments that go along with those metrics as to, is GDP better? Is, fewer people in poverty better? Is greater equity better? One thing we don't talk about is all these technologies have an enormous impact on the environment. Something like, I forget what the number is. It's some crazy number, but it's somewhere between like 1% and maybe 10%, maybe one of the panelists can correct me on this, of global emissions comes from data centers, a lot of which is associated with crypto mining, right? Like that's a serious question to go and answer, right? And the more of these models we put out there, then the more work that we do, the more data centers we're going to need to build, and the more of a carbon footprint we're going to have. So they're non-trivial questions to work through.
The statistic I remember is if you put the global ICT sector, which was driven primarily in terms of its output, and compared to the countries, it would be fourth largest in the world. So it's something in that order. I can't remember the actual percent. But maybe to pick up on the question in a slightly different way. So it's, is it going to restrict thinking outside the box or creativity? I think it's going to put the spotlight more on human creativity, because if you think that using AI applications, and we'll spread this broader than just ChatGPT, that can automate much of the menial, manual, time-consuming tasks, and as Peter said, shifting data from here to there, copy paste, put a bit of commentary around it. The vast majority of professional services work involves some level of manual tasks like that are not really using your creativity. And there are various estimates for various jobs as how much you can be able to automate that. But if you were to say in your 40-hour working week, if anyone does those, that 30 of them were spent doing that kind of work that could now be automated. What much more value now that you say, well, listen, I can actually take my head up and I can look at the problems I'm trying to solve rather than just processing the tasks that I need to do. I think you're going to see that it will put the spotlight on being creative, being human, thinking outside of the box. Let the technology do what the technology does, but then let me see how I can push the boundaries. So that's the promise, and I do believe it. I think most of us would love to go, you know what, if I could just say, get that task done, and it was done to your satisfaction, your problem solving muscles will start to kick in a lot more.
Okay, I want to turn to a really important topic, and it's one that we, I guess, need to continually be thinking about. And so I ask Elizabeth to lead us off by addressing some of the legal and ethical issues. We've touched on a few of them, and this is an area she's thought deeply about and continues to. So we're looking forward to what you have to say, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Gloria. And I think it actually builds off of Anil's question about sort of thinking about, are we restricted, and also to the human nature part, because I hear Mark talking about it being used in the healthcare context as this assistive technology. And I think that that's great. I think Anil's hitting the nail on the head, which is that the human nature side is, if you are a busy physician and these things are prompting you, right? Yes, you are in the driver's seat. You are ultimately making that decision on healthcare. But over time, it's like if you're using Grammarly or spell check or something, right? We tend to just, that looks good. We'll take that, right? And so the consequences, as I think, Mark and Peter are delineating, whether it's healthcare, whether it's customer service, whether it's, targeted drone strikes, right? There's a range of human decision making that will be using this technology, and thinking about it in a range of outcomes requires us to constantly put ethics at the forefront, I think. And I think the healthcare example Mark used was great. So I'll just kind of use that one. When we think about some of the issues that crop up, and the ones that are really concerning to me, this idea of having the smartest, greatest resident who knows all the research at your shoulder, we have to recognize that all of that past research too, there is so much bias, right? So we know when we talk about statistics and using this as math and statistics, we know statistically speaking, outcomes are worse for people of color in the US in our healthcare system, right? And that's for a range of reasons. Both, discrimination, access to healthcare, the way that they're treated, representation within the healthcare industry itself. So there's all this stuff that if we were to rely solely on past outcomes and past treatment protocols to continue treating people, we're just kind of embedding and encoding past bias and having present discrimination, right? So we want to eliminate that. So there's that ethical issue, right? So how do we ensure that, again, we're just not replicating past discrimination? There's issues of privacy, of course, and I think the healthcare context is a good one because that's an industry in which we've already wrestled with this, right? In healthcare, laws and HIPAA, right? So there are already some guardrails about what you can and cannot do. In the legal profession, so doctors, lawyers, we have within our profession, if I were to use ChatGPT, say, for my client and input all of their data into the system, I would be breaching very clearly an ethical duty that I have of confidentiality to my client. And we have a system in place that if that got out, I would be booted. I couldn't be a lawyer anymore, right? If a doctor breached their patient confidentiality by lugging their patient's data into ChatGPT to get an outcome, they too would be censured and sanctioned, right? Data programmers, right? Peter, probably you do something and, oops, right? Like whether you can continue doing your job or not, obviously there's a public, there'll be a public reaction and there'll be professional consequences, but it's a little bit different. So, right. So thinking though about how as an industry and as a profession, we're going to say, are we comfortable enough as a society with voluntary ethical standards. What do those look like? Do they have any teeth? There are many, right? I mean, those of you there in EU, right? There are hundreds of different emerging protocols and guardrails and frameworks for embedding ethics into this technology. Now, how does it all work, right? What happens when it's breached? How are we going to hold each other accountable? And then I think this bigger question, I alluded to one big question, which is really, whose perspectives, whose lived experience is sort of embedded in the AI that is going to continually kind of snowball into informing and guiding our decision making. But also, what are our priorities? So thinking about it in healthcare, right? I'm thinking about, and this is kind of what Kieran is getting at too, like how much will this free us up to say either be more creative, or in the healthcare context, is this going to produce truly, genuinely better health outcomes for more people, right? I would say personally, that would be my goal for this as we look at AI in either assisting or automating decision-making in healthcare. Really, what's the goal? To like, wow, use this powerful technology to make people healthier, right? You could, however, if, situations are different and who's at the table with thinking about how this technology is used, use it solely to make healthcare more profitable, right? Which you can see on a global scale, we have different systems of healthcare, whether you're in Ireland, whether you're in the US, what we as a society in those places have made decisions about as to how we're going to prioritize healthcare and who has access to it. And, so how this is working has ethical implications, not just for individual managers within a firm, say, but for those of us in society about how we're going to allocate those risks and rewards of this technology. I think those are, so there's like micro ethical issues of decision making, and then there's sort of macro societal issues. And there's so many more that I could fill up the rest of our time, and I'm not going to, so I'll cut here. And if there's additional questions, I'm happy to talk about very specific examples where we're seeing this, or in the legal context as well.
So this is one question I've always had on the legal side. And from an AI perspective is sort of the concept of liability. So who is liable? Should we just say it's all Microsoft fault? OpenAI, we'll just sue them.
Thanks, Peter.
Nah.
But when we talk about those things, at some point the rubber hits the road from a legal perspective, and it's about liability. Is it the programmer? Is it the technology? Is it I have to say I don't know. I don't know, and it's a gray area until it gets tested. But I'd like to understand a little bit more about thoughts in that area.
Yeah, that's another one that is going to be really critical as we think about, and it's going to, as you note, going to sort of differ jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? So those of you who anyone who's involved in sort of global compliance and thinking about how your activities, I'm sure Peter, that's your wheelhouse, right? And thinking about what you're doing as a global corporation, and then how that's playing out across every nation, every different legal approach to liability, even within the US, different states and liability. This is going to be a question. Yeah, at what point, we saw this, even in earlier conversations about AI and self-driving cars, right? So who ultimately is liable? If you're the driver there, we're going to hold you accountable, but you bought this car with the promise that you could take the hands off the wheel. But we don't have in place systems of negligence in the US that account for you using this this technology. We do have, of course, systems of apportioning liability such that if you get into an accident and then you have a valid claim against the self-driving car manufacturer for having a defective product, right? Just as if I used a lawnmower and it took off on me and it ran over, my neighbor's dog, right? If it was not my fault, I still owe the neighbor for compensating him or her on the dog. I can turn around now and go to the manufacturer of the lawnmower and say, okay, you violated the contract with me. You have strict liability on the product here. Now you pay me. So we have that in place. It's not that it's completely foreign, but it's something to consider, again, at a macro level. Who's going to bear the risks of these products when things go wrong? Should we feel comfortable that OpenAI is, ostensibly, and this comes up a lot on the intellectual property space, like a not-for-profit, it's just a research, it's funded by folks like Microsoft and others, right? with the goal of creating this technology that then will be used by private entities. But initially, the technology is a sort of weird hybrid space of public investment and not-for-profit organization. So some of this is, these are very much present questions about how we're creating the landscape for law and ethics application.
Yeah, completely agree. We see it all the time. Just to be, say it out loud, I am here representing myself, not my company.
yeah.
So this is not a defensive, of whatever. But I mean, there are lots of areas in society where we're still struggling with, understanding, is the tool manufacturer responsible for any harm? I think the good news that I've seen is I haven't seen GPT being used yet in a way that would cause physical harm. The guide rails and the caution that we've seen, and don't quote me on that, because I'm sure something will come up tomorrow and like somebody was harmed by it. But I mean, in general, we're talking about real world examples where there's something physical happening, like a car, lawnmower, other things like that. In this case, the type of physical harm that AI can produce that's still a big question to me. So I don't know. Like I know there's obviously military applications, there's other things like that. But those have a very strong decision-making framework already in place. And I don't see that really going away in those particular contexts personally. But it is something to think about. And one of the things that is like a recent development that I thought was pretty interesting was, we've now have GPT, which makes all these associations, and then it like guesses what it should like return back to you. And it's very interesting. Now there's Auto GPT, which will then take the output of that and then make its own decisions about whether that's right or not, and then, continue to correct itself until it then pushes back. And then that starts to like spiral out of control a little bit in my mind. Like maybe there should be like the Asimov 3 laws of robotics or 3 laws of AI or something. I don't know. People have, done that before, proposed that before, but it does start to get to the point where you're like, all right, there's a point where, the guardrails have to be more than just a framework or an idea. It has to be able to be implemented in a technological way, like we've implemented on other systems, like control systems for planes and trains and stuff like that, have all kinds of, frameworks and actual technical controls to ensure that it doesn't go off the rails, right? So I think that's where we need to start doing a lot more research. Needs to be a lot more evaluation frameworks that are put out around this technology. I know, like, for example, NVIDIA put out NeMo, which helps with that framework some, but, I think there just needs to be a lot more research into that, because I don't personally like the idea of it correcting itself. That starts to get a little interesting, a little uncomfortable in my mind.
I want to take a couple of questions from the audience. One is, and this is one that probably we all want to know, and this was whether ChatGPT or something similar to that is going to be the next search engine. Like when is it really going to like hit? And so I've always thought it'd be really cool if I could just talk to my computer rather than, of having to type so much and things like that. But anyway, and part of the question is what kind of adaptation is needed to use it as a search engine?
Well, I can just say real quick from a technical perspective, Bing, Google, and other areas are already implementing it as a part of the search engine, just because it makes great associations. And then I see a lot of customers who are implementing that internally. And the next version, GPT-4, will enable that in a much better way for sure. So we're already seeing that. Like everything though, and like in any search model, anything, they can't go from raw input, raw output directly to user. There has to be applications surrounded to be able to check input, check to make sure that it's kind of the right thing and so forth. So there always has to be kind of an application around that, but we definitely see it be used a lot in search.
I really like the Bing search now, which, I did not in all honesty, use Bing before this. And now what I like about it actually is one of those issues too, is it does tell you where the sources come from and gives you places to go. Unlike ChatGPT, which you have no way as the user to know where this is coming from or to test its veracity. So I think the more, just as a user, from the user's perspective, the more users can also do that and check the work, I think is actually, from a marketing perspective, I think it would be helpful, as well as hit some of the ethical accountability issues.
Yep.
So Peter mentioned all of GPT, and I'm certain you know a lot more than I do about it, because I've just started doing a bit of research on it. But one of the mini videos I saw on it, so for those that don't know, it's integrating essentially AI agents into the process that can help make decisions and accomplish tasks. So it does something for you. So one of the videos I saw was a user who instructed it to build an app, right? As part of that process of doing it, it noticed, all the GPT says, oh, well, you don't have Node installed. It Googled it, found Stack Overflow article, downloaded it, extracted it, spawned the server, and then kept on going to build the app, right? So, when I saw that happening, I was going, search is dead, search is over, right? That's passive, right? Now you're getting on into a completely different area, or where you're being active, and it's not just find the information, it's do something with it, right? Because most of the time when we're looking to search information, it's probably to do something with it, right? Rather than just pure education. So yeah, who knows how long search will live? It'll spawn into something else.
Yeah, there's some interesting experiments going on. There's some beta testing going on for some of that too. So we're not seeing all of it just yet. I can get one or two more questions in here. One really looks at, and we're getting close on time, will ChatGPT types of technologies speed up Web 3.0 in the metaverse? And it's interesting to think about it used in the metaverse. I've done a little bit of work in, or at least looking at the metaverse. Some companies are building their own. So I was able to take my class into what they call the Mindverse. It's a Baltimore company that has built their own metaverse. It looks like their company, and we move around in it. It was very interesting. But is there an application there?
Metaverse is one of those that's also very early. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was just going to say, jumping a little bit out of my depth, because I haven't spent that much time in the metaverse. In fact, I've spent 0 time in the metaverse, which is probably a sign of my age. But I mean, in one sense, the trivial answer is absolutely, right? Because ChatGPT is already being used to write code, right? It's already being used to create applications like we were talking about, right? It's able to do these things. So, and in theory, all of the sorts of things that you can do in the physical universe, you're supposed to be able to do in the metaverse, right? Obviously, with some differences between the physical and the meta, of course, right? But so anything that you would want to use it for in the quote unquote real world, or IRL, right? You should be able to use it for in the metaverse as well. So I mean, I would imagine that it'll be very useful in that context. And in fact, interestingly enough, right? Perhaps you could, given the amount of the volume of information that the metaverse will eventually be creating in any given moment, perhaps ChatGPT type technologies would be the only way to really get a pulse or a sense of what's going on and how to effectively make use of that medium.
Yeah, I would say we're starting to see applications in gaming, which, my company defines metaverse really only in gaming terms. And that's where you're seeing, non-playable characters or NPCs being able to make, kind of different decisions or interact in different ways by using some of these GPT models. Are still very early on in that way. That could be one area, though, where we see, a lot more use of these types of technologies. I don't know about Web 3.0 though. Like, I don't know how that specifically, I'd have to think about that. I don't see that popping up ever.
I'm going to see if I can squeeze in one more question, and then I'm going to have to cut us off because we're out of time. But this one really has to do, this is from a UCC colleague, so thank you, Simon. But anyway, can these kinds of models help us with analysis of research data or data analytics projects?
Yeah.
So
Yep,
you say the
100%.
answer, if the answer
100%.
resounding, yes, they can.
100%. Yeah.
People are already
100%.
doing- yeah.
Yeah.
People are already doing that.
I know some labs where every lab meeting starts with people reviewing what ChatGPT has suggested about the data that they collected over the last week.
Mhm.
That's
I
kind of
actually-
interesting. So what do they do? Feed it the data and say, what do you
And-
see?
Yeah, pretty much, right? I mean, and this is that whole notion of prompt engineering, right? This whole sort of separate skill about how do you prep the data and the question, right, in a manner that's going to get you an output that's useful or meaningful. But
Yep.
Very nice. Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time. So I'm going to thank our panel before I turn it back over to Kira for a last word. But it's such an engaging conversation and such an interesting technology. So I would really like to really thank our experts and thank you for your viewpoints and for sharing and really just helping us all think a little bit, because I always think sometimes one fun thing about IT and kind of the area of data science is we're looking at the future, and Elizabeth points out we're looking at the future for a small subset of people, but there's a whole bunch of other people behind us that we need to be thinking about how we can use it to their benefit as well. And so I just tremendously appreciate your time and your expertise and your willingness to help us all think. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kira to say a final word on behalf of IFIP.
Thank you, and thank you, Gloria, for your moderation today. It's been most excellent, and thanks again to all of our panelists. Just to, I suppose, announce that we're looking forward to launching our call for papers for our next conference in 2024, which, and we're interested in the topic of decision support and analytics for the common good. So many topics worth considering and proposed today as part of the conversation. I think I'll leave the final word to GPT on this one. So when asked, should we fear AI and generative AI, GPT tells us it's important to remember that AI is created and programmed by humans. Therefore, the risks associated with these technologies are ultimately the responsibility of those who design and implement them. Thanks to you all for today. We look forward to hearing from you again in the future at our next panel session. And thanks to our panelists. Fantastic session.